Wow, welcome everybody. We are so thankful that you have chosen to spend part of your evening with us. My name is Diane Bergman, and this session, just so you know, is going to be recorded and microphones will be remain muted just because there's a lot of us on the call, so then we'll be able to hear everything. But we would love to still hear from you. So if you'd like to make comments or if you have questions, please put them on the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. Tonight is an evening about connection and stories, and we're very excited to introduce you to some very special guests.
Yes, thanks, Diane. Welcome, everyone. My name is Richard Bergman, and I'm pleased to introduce our first guest, Kimberly D. Schmidt, PhD, Professor of History, Emerita from Eastern Mennonite University. Kimberly first set foot in Europe as a spirited 19-year-old trainee over 40 years ago, working with Mennonite families in Basel and Germany. She was captivated by early Anabaptist sites and the communities that remembered their history. Kimberly went on to study American history and led Renaissance and Reformation study tours for EMU students. These tours highlighted not just well-known leaders, but also the women and peasants whose voices and actions mattered. The through line from early Anabaptist history to the history of Mennonite missions among Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples during the late 19th and early 20th centuries is a focus on the experiences of women. Kimberly has several publications that explore Mennonite women's agency in the 19th and 20th centuries contexts.
Richard and I very much love spending time and collaborating with Kimberly. Her passion and insight shine a light on gender and class in Anabaptist history and deepen our understanding, as she will for the rest of you tonight. Just this spring, we worked with her in Italy, doing some tour development for a new tour, and it was amazing. We were discovering castles and villages and hidden gems where Anabaptist women spread the Protestant faith. While Kimberly is brilliant, and I promise you she is, I know that firsthand, she is delightfully down to earth. When Richard and I every afternoon needed our pick me up, usually it was gelato, Kimberly was very happy to come along, and we enjoyed that as well. So, Kimberly, welcome, and it's your stage now.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, well, thank you so much to Richard and Diane. It has been an absolute delight to work with them, and I look forward to many years of collaborative, fruitful work. I think we could go ahead and start with the title slide. There we go. Okay. On November 18, 1525, a defiant Margaret Hottinger was jailed in Zurich's Wellenberg Tower. She was the daughter of a lower-class peasant, Jacob Hottinger. In the court records, the authorities noted, "We decided that she be spoken to," and asked whether she will persist in rebaptism and the teaching of Grebel, Manz, etc., and if she persists, she should be placed in Wellenberg. So next slide. Okay. The authorities spoke to Margaret and she refused to recant. She remained in Wellenberg Tower for over a year, subsisting on bread and water. When questioned, she denied that male leaders were present at any meetings and that it was, quote, just some women who had gathered. The authorities did not follow up on their questioning of Margaret. They weren't interested in the meetings of just some women. Historian C. Arnold Snyder wrote in Profiles of Anabaptist Women, quote, "It was their mistake. From evidence elsewhere, we know that these apparently innocent women's gatherings were actually subversive conventicles and formed the hidden backbone of the movement." This year, Mennonite congregations and communities are commemorating the 500th anniversary of the beginning of Anabaptism. We are telling our origin story, but how are we telling it? Who is included, excluded? Do these inclusions and exclusions influence our understanding of our religious heritage? That's fine, you can go to the next one. Anabaptism's history, as I'm assuming all of us on this webinar have been taught, started with the first adult baptisms in early modern Europe, which were initiated on January 21st, 1525, by York Blaurock, Conrad Grebel, and Felix Manz. I refer to these guys as the Zurich Three. A survey of recent popular Mennonite popular and scholarly journals and online celebrations and webinars has revealed plenty of mention of the Zurich Three, along with Michael Sattler. In the publications and during the celebrations, there has been little to no mention of peasants, even though, as prominent historians have asserted, many Anabaptists fought, or you might say Anabaptist adjacent, or maybe they weren't all like fully in the Anabaptist movement, but people who were supporting the Anabaptist movement were seeing a lot of overlap between those folks and folks who fought in or supported the 1525 Peasants' War. And the 1525 Peasants' War was basically a movement to demand an end to the economic oppression of the feudal system. So here we have a secular, not just a religious, but also secular concerns coming to the fore. When women are included in our celebrations, it's always as pious, humble, maybe even submissive martyrs. When we extend our fields of inquiry beyond the Zurich Three and other elite males to include women and peasants, alternate stories emerge and alternate geographies emerge. Including women and peasants expands our understanding of where Anabaptists were active. Many of us so-called cradle North American Mennonites know about our Swiss, German, and Dutch heritage. What is less well known is how Anabaptism was also quite strong in areas controlled by Austria's monarchs, the Habsburgs. So here you have in this, the one map with the green, that's where that was Habsburg control, okay, back in 1544, including most of Spain. You can also see the Netherlands. In the middle map, you can see that Austria is shaped kind of like a tadpole, and the tail of the tadpole is where you see Tyrol, and Tyrol also goes down into Italy. And back in the day, this lower map on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see North Tyrol in pink, and Südtirol in beige. And we're going to be talking a lot about Tyrol as we move through this presentation. But Südtirol and North Tyrol were divided in 1919 after World War I. So that's why they're not considered Tyrol as a whole today. But interest in Tyrolean Anabaptism, but also Austrian Anabaptism, as well as the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Northern Italy, particularly Venice, is gaining ground among historians. These newer treatments include the experiences of the little people, of women and peasants. And as these examinations break new ground, they challenge our dominant narratives. Next slide. Much of what we know about women in Austrian Anabaptism started with Dr. Greta Menzensefi. Menzensefi was an Austrian historian. She was born in Vienna. She produced 138 publications, including 3 highly acclaimed books. She was the first woman to chair a department at the University of Vienna. And the second half of her life, she devoted herself to the Anabaptist movement in Austria. By 1972, she had translated all of the Austrian Tyrolean court records related to Anabaptist interrogations and sentencing. Since Menzensefi, Canadians Linda A. Huebert Hecht and C. Arnold Snyder and Germans Marion Cobalt Grosch and Astrid von Schlachter have published several groundbreaking works. And if you're interested in further reading, I would start with Huebert Hecht and von Schlachter. I need to say here that I have merely mined these secondary sources produced by these dedicated historians. I see myself as an amplifier or popularizer of their scholarship. We know from the historical research that women were very active in the Anabaptist movement. Linda Huebert Hecht found that in Austria's North Tyrol, women comprised almost 1/2 or 46% of the persons brought into courtrooms for questioning. She compared this to Lutheran and Reformed groups where only 6% of those brought in for questioning were women. Over 40% of the Anabaptist martyrs were women. In North and South Tyrol, Habsburg court records show how Anabaptism spread through women's household, kinship, and guild networks. Upper-class women proselytized their maids and cooks. Servants could easily convey messages from house to house, to small shops, to marketplaces, and into countryside villages and hamlets without inciting suspicion. Literate Anabaptist women read, preached, and testified to their neighbors and kin while sewing, spinning, and weaving. And I would have to say, never underestimate the power of a sewing circle. Now, Agnes Link was one such woman who read to spinning and weaving groups of both men and women. She was apprehended and interrogated twice by Swiss authorities, first in Solothurn and then in Basel. Remarkably, she was set free both times. She was not pious or submissive. She had a fast and sharp tongue and was well versed in biblical texts and Anabaptist thought. She was more than a match for any local magistrate. She used the courtroom as a pulpit. She not only testified, she was testifiant. Her second haul into court was precipitated by her purchase of a New Testament in a bookstore in Basel. The bookseller testified on her behalf during her trial, and she was set free from prison without having to pay fines incurred, which was highly unusual, and she didn't have to swear a loyalty oath to the local magistrate, which was unheard of. Like Agnes, the aforementioned Margaret Hottinger was a peasant and literate. And this Zolliken is where the Hottingers you might have their stronghold, you might say. She was a member of this extensive Hottinger family, many of whom were guild members and peasants active in the movement. Now, peasants had to pay taxes to the state and tithes to the church, and the Hottingers, along with other peasants, were opposed to the system. The Hottingers argued for local control of both clerics and funds. No more taking directives from a faraway bishop or sending money to Zurich when they needed the money at home. The Hottingers helped to found the first Anabaptist church in Zolliken, and for them and many other lower class folks who became Anabaptists, these issues of local autonomy, of being able to choose their own priests, the issues of economic justice were just as important as adult baptism. The Hottinger family exemplifies how family clans were also present in powerful guilds. Local authorities were reluctant to cooperate with Habsburg orders to apprehend high-status Anabaptists. Habsburg Archduke Ferdinand I was a virulent and tireless Anabaptist hunter. He was educated in Spain by Spanish inquisitors, and his crackdowns on Anabaptists were severe. He resided most of the year in Vienna, but also in Innsbruck, which is in North Tyrol. From Vienna or Innsbruck, he wrote letters instructing local magistrates about individuals whom he thought should be apprehended, tried, and in most cases, immediately executed. He didn't want to wait around. For example, we have a series of letters to a local judge from Ferdinand I. This local judge lived in Sud Tyrol, and Ferdinand I wanted him to prosecute a baker's wife immediately. The judge delayed for months, severely frustrating the efforts of Archduke Ferdinand. Now, we don't have the name of this baker's wife, but one person for whom we have a name and good information beyond court records was noblewoman Helena von Freyburg. She harbored fleeing Anabaptists in her family castle, and it's pictured here. Helena's noble birth and powerful husband saved her from life-threatening prosecution. Nonetheless, she was forced to flee her castle and leave her beloved Tyrol homeland, and she had to do this twice. Wherever she went, she started small house churches, harbored refugees, gave immigrants money, and she outwitted the authorities. She was not a martyr. She died peacefully in Augsburg in 1545. South of the Alps, in the Puster Valley, in what is now northern Italy, lived another wealthy, noble Anabaptist woman who, through her actions, created and supported a small Anabaptist community. Like Helena von Freyburg, Elizabeth von Wolkenstein harbored Anabaptist refugees in her residence. Now, this castle that pictured here is still in the Wolkenstein noble family. And in fact, when we visited it, there was a little doorbell that said Graf Wolkenstein, Lord Wolkenstein, which we rang several times, and no noble person, came out to greet us, unfortunately. But Elizabeth's residence was not at this castle. It was in this smaller residence. It's still a family residence, and it's in the small village of Utenheim, which is not too far from this massive castle. Her extended family was sympathetic to Anabaptists. Elizabeth's son-in-law, Michael von Tutenhofen, and his castle administrator, Erhard Zimmermann, harbored Anabaptists in von Tutenhofen's Neuhaus Castle, which is also still extant. In fact, we hope to stop at Neuhaus Castle and get a bite to eat in their adjoining restaurant during our 2026 tours. Now, Elizabeth was captured and interrogated in February 1534, and this castle that you see was a place of interrogation for people that were fighting against church and state authorities. I don't think that any Anabaptists were held there. We don't have records of that, but it wasn't a place where they did hold people who were fighting against church and state authorities. Her testimony was drawn out. After 4 court dates over about 4.5 months and several visits from family and priests, she publicly recanted in June. The state confiscated her house and household goods, but eventually turned everything back to her oldest son, who had never left the Catholic Church. She was forced to flee from her home in Utenheim to Brixen, where she died, year unknown. Now, one of the persons that Elizabeth's family harbored in Neuhaus Castle, and here's Neuhaus Castle, was Jacob Hutter, after whom the Hutterites are named. He was also the husband of Katharina Proust Hutter. The court records do not state that Katharina ever took refuge in Neuhaus Castle, but it's a possibility, as both Hutters traveled extensively from Südtirol, where the castle is located, to Moravia, which is in current-day Czech Republic, and there were a number of protected Anabaptist communities in Moravia. So if you could make it through Ferdinand I's nets, and get to Moravia, you could kind of be assured that you would have safety there. We know that Katharina offered food to Anabaptists hiding in the woods in this area, so this castle would have been a familiar landmark to her. Jacob and Katharina were born about 45 miles apart. She was in Sterzing, so if you look at the yellow map on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see Sterzing is the highest red dot, and then Bruneck, which isn't too far away, is just east of San Lorenzo, and Jacob was born in San Lorenzo. So those are those two areas kind of in the northern part of Südtirol. Now, Katharina was a maid in the wealthy and prominent household of Paul and Justina Gall. And here you have an example of wealthy people proselytizing their servants. The Galls were Anabaptists. They hosted Jacob in their home, and this is where we believe Jacob and Katharina met, and where Jacob baptized Katharina into the Anabaptist faith in 1532. Along with members of the Gall household, she was arrested in 1533. She recanted, was freed, and with Justina Gall left for Moravia probably to this town of Nikolsburg. And we go there on our tours. And Paul Gall also left for Moravia by another route. He was apprehended and immediately executed. But Katharina and Justina made it to Moravia, and there Katharina married Jacob in 1535. Now, we know that Jacob made this trip between Moravia and Südtirol at least 4 times. He also traveled to Helena von Freyburg's area of operations north of the Alps, although I'm not sure that their paths ever crossed. The Archduke Ferdinand I inherited Moravia, and this was the end of these protected communities there. He began a persecution campaign against what had been a protected community of immigrants and refugees. The Hutters, with many others, were forced to flee. Südtirol was familiar territory, and Katharina knew of women who would shelter them. So they made the trek back to their homeland. By this time, spies were sent out by the authorities to track and arrest Jacob because he had become a known Anabaptist leader. Jacob and Katharina were arrested on November 30th, 1535. So they were basically arrested as newlyweds. Jacob was eventually packed off to Innsbruck, where he was burned at the stake in early February 1536. Now, Katharina at this point was a relapsee, and as such would not have been offered a second trial. I mean, normally relapsees were executed immediately, but she was not promptly tried and executed. Profiles authors write that she survived because powerful people protected her, even though she stubbornly held fast to her faith and refused to recant. Quote, because her stubbornness made such an impression on the judges, she was not sent to work in the bishop's residence in Brixen for fear that she would lead others astray into the Anabaptist sect. So she succeeded in escaping prison. She must have had help and continued to live in this beautiful area undetected for another 3 years. Her arrest in 1538 was followed by immediate execution. So at this time, she's been arrested 3 times. She was a partner with Jacob in the faith. Her connections in Tyrol sheltered her and her husband and arguably prolonged her existence. We will now travel to France. And we'll talk a little bit about Margarita Pruss of Strasbourg. She's another example of a courageous woman who worked diligently to spread Anabaptist beliefs. Margarita's father was a prominent printer. Strasbourg printers were on the vanguard of publishing radical materials. Margarita's father died. Now, the business passed not to his oldest son, as was mandated by guild rules, but instead to Margarita's husband. So the business was passed through the female line. Margarita grew up in the family business. She must have learned it well. To run a printing shop, a woman had to be married, guild rules. So when husband number 1 died, she remarried another printer. He passed away and she married again. With each succeeding marriage, she aligned with increasingly radical husbands, men who embraced Anabaptist ideas, until her 3rd husband, Balthasar Beck, became well known for printing Anabaptist writings. When between husbands, Margaret published Anabaptist writings, including testimonies of Anabaptist women. She did not shy away from radical thinking, and she promoted Anabaptist women's ideas. So these experiences of the little people force us to consider the many and varied expressions of Anabaptism, not just of the Anabaptist elite. The voices of the little people challenge us to identify with and listen to the peasants of our day, immigrants and refugees, those fleeing repressive and violent governments. Their testimonies encourage us to not be passive or submissive, but instead, in Linda Huebert Hecht's words, to speak up and take risks. The lives and arguments of the little people enlarged the Anabaptist movement from the religious to the secular sphere. Agitating for economic justice, as witnessed by the Peasants' War and the peasants' unhappiness with taxes and tithes, was also at the heart of the Anabaptist movement. Some of these concerns predate the Zurich adult baptisms by at least 2 years. And this is the Anabaptism I think that is invigorating our church today. A mass email from Mennonite Action's leadership team to its members included these words, quote, the radical commitment to peace, justice, and community at the heart of the Anabaptist faith calls us to resist empire, oppression, and violence in all its forms. The sustained resistance was led by the little people and not just by Grebel, Manz, Blaurock, although their influence was great. By 1528, they had all passed either from execution or from disease. The movement did not wither when the early male elites were killed or died. The movement spread from farm to village, from hamlet to city, through kinship networks, house meetings, through guilds, as numerous court records make clear. Women were the hidden backbone of the Anabaptist movement. It took more than just a few men at the top of some imagined patriarchal pyramid to sustain the movement. And today I ask us to rightly remember early Anabaptist commitments to social justice, economic parity, peace, church autonomy, resistance to state coercion, and the inclusion of the priesthood to all believers. That is, to be courageous enough to love one another, to love God, and to speak up and act accordingly. That concludes my portion.
Thank you, Kim. Wow. As I said, Kim is full of knowledge. And what I also love touring with her is the very, very few times that she was uncertain about something, she would pull out one of her books from her backpack. It would have many, many sticky notes out the side, and she would have the answer in moments because she knew exactly where to look. So it was great. One thing I was just going to mention is the chat is open. And so it's fine if you want to just listen and enjoy. But as we're talking, if you have a question for Kim, please just feel free to share it in the chat.
We have another very special guest this evening to introduce to you, and that's Shirley Hershey Showalter. Shirley is a graduate of EMU. She was a professor of English for 21 years and then served as the president of Goshen College for 8 years. Shirley is married to Stuart Showalter. She is the mother of Anthony and Kate and grandmother to Owen, Julia, and Lydia.
Shirley is the co-founder of Grandmas for Love, and she has written 2 books, one called Blush, A Mennonite Girl Meets a Glittering World, and the other called The Mindful Grandparent, which I'm not there yet, but I know that that will be on my night table in a few years, probably.
Not too quickly.
I'm excited, but it's not. We're just in the getting married stage.
Yeah.
We are going to now move to a time of discussion where Shirley and Kimberly will be sharing some meaningful experiences from their recent tour together to Europe of these untold stories.
Should I just ask the questions then? Or, okay.
Open it up. And then, yeah, for the rest of us, feel free to add something to the chat, and then Richard and I will pose it to the ladies.
Okay. So Shirley, it's just wonderful having you along on this trip. She and Stuart were so supportive and, asked good questions of Mary Sprunger, my co-leader, and myself. And I just, you've had a few weeks, couple months, actually, more than a couple of months since the tour. And I'd just like to know, as you reflect on the tour, what aspects of the tour stood out to you?
Well, I think I would have to highlight the combination of fun and seriousness. I'll chart a lot of that to both you and Mary for the personality and the diligence, but also the holding the whole project lightly and inviting us to see you learning along with us. It was new for you. It was new for us. You, of course, had done a lot of study in advance, but it was a project of a great deal of interwoven relationships and, like I said, seriousness and fun. I love the kind of travel that involves my mind as well as my eyes, my ears, all my senses. I want to fit a new trip into what I already know, and then hopefully it will enlarge my world and my understanding of in this case, my faith and my community. So every time I go on a trip, I make a little notebook out of it. And the Tour Imagination people were great. They gave us very detailed itineraries. I started with that kind of thing, with some maps, with some readings that we did in advance of the tour. We had a bibliography. We asked for and received a bibliography. And I would recommend to anybody considering this trip that you start with a new basic history of the Radical Reformation, a global survey of Anabaptist history by Troy Osborne. I think he's at Conrad Grebel University and a Goshen College graduate. A very fine compilation of the research of other people. And then we were also recommended to look at or study these books, the Linda Huebert Hecht book, Women in Early Austrian Anabaptism, and C. Arnold Snyder and Linda Huebert Hecht, Profiles of Anabaptist Women. I can't say I read all of that, but I did read the Troy Osborne book, and I read in and around some of the other things. And those materials were very helpful in advance. And I would say this was just like a joyous graduate seminar. And I loved it.
Yeah, our participants asked us to send them a bibliography, and I think I was like, they're asking two PhDs in history for a bibliography. Like, how many pages should we limit? So, yeah, there were there's a lot of, I mean, the awesome thing is that there's just a lot of great scholarship that's coming out. I've just been reading about Anabaptists in Venice, and that's a whole nother area. And the scholarship is, the titles are 2024, 2025. They've just come out. These are German scholars. So there's some really interesting things that are happening there. Yeah, so I appreciate your holding up the books. If you're interested in the Peasants' War, Lindell Roper is an Australian historian, and this book is I think it's might be a 2024, I think it's a 2025 imprint. It's called Summer of Fire and Blood, and the German Peasants' War. And she really latches on to Anabaptism, and she calls for historians to start looking more closely at the connections between the Peasants' War and Anabaptism. She makes the claim that the areas where the Peasants' War was the strongest was also the area where Anabaptism was the strongest. And she wants people to do more investigation of that. And she really looks at people like Hans Hut, Balthasar Hubmaier, some of these guys who don't get as much recognition as being very prominent in both movements. So that would be another one to kind of keep in mind. Yeah. Shirley, any encounters that really surprised you or kind of made you rethink what you thought you knew about Anabaptist history? Did we change your narrative? Oh. Okay.
I didn't take any Anabaptist history classes in college myself, so I didn't even have an overview, but I did have my own catechism book, and just because I was at Goshen College, I was surrounded by all these historians, and I learned a lot by attending conferences and things like that. But my touring was focused on Switzerland. For me, my first surprise was, having grown up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, was that I didn't have my heritage was Swiss German, not German, as I thought, because my original immigrant came from Germany, but I didn't know that they had fled there from Switzerland, where they had lived for centuries, and that this little German experience was a short one. So that was an awakening. But most of the travel then went back to the Untold Valley. And so in the same way that the three progenitor men in Switzerland kind of take up all the space in my head about Anabaptist history, the geography of Anabaptist history was Zurich and its surrounding areas. And I knew about the Dutch, and I had been to Amsterdam, but I hadn't even visited the Mennonite. I hadn't seen up close what a Dutch church was like, which we included in this tour. But the big surprise from this tour was that we were spending most of our time in Austria and a little excursion into the Czech Republic, some France, and of course Germany and Switzerland. But that the geography of all of Europe actually was very much a part of Anabaptist history. And both the people and the places were new to me. And that was very exciting. So as you prepare for 26 and you add Tyrol, you get into Italy, we didn't even do that. So those of you who are considering going next year, you're going to have a chance to have even more expansion of your geography. The fact that Anabaptists were not only, that women were not only involved, but that all of the layers of society of women were involved. The very wealthy had a significant role to play, and yet probably the great percentage of the women involved were peasants. And the Peasants' War was this background to the whole drama. Here we've always emphasized our pacifism and the Schleitheim Confession and not taking the sword, very, very important part. But then there was, a number of examples of Anabaptists who did take up the sword and to visit Munster and to think about, here was a group of people called Anabaptists. So it's not like you can totally reject them. They're part of what's happening. And the fact that to me, at least, it seemed that there was a great deal of patriarchal emphasis there. So they lost pacifism and they took up patriarchy at the same time. To me, as a person not reading the original materials, coming into it as shall we say, a somewhat educated tourist, it seemed very interesting to try to figure out the role of this Munster experiment in the midst of Anabaptist history and its impact on women as well. So one of the things that I enjoyed the most, Kim, were the times when you imagined conversations between Margaret Hottinger and who were the others?
Agnes Link.
Yeah. I would encourage you to continue to use your imagination and to bring the personalities as much as possible of these real people who lived so long ago into your very able tour guidance.
Thank you. Yeah. I said Agnes Link is this sharp-tongued, testifiant woman who was able to evade being executed twice. And I have an imagined conversation between her and Margaret Hottinger. They were both literate peasant women who read to sewing circles. And I don't think their paths ever crossed, but it's interesting. And this is also based on the court records that we have from Agnes Link and Margaret Hottinger. And I tried to make it really obvious, like so for example, they're talking over cell phones, right? And Margaret's on her way. She's trying to get to Moravia, and Agnes is just like, you won't believe I just got hauled into court again in Basel for buying a New Testament. I mean, this is crazy. Why are they persecuting me for buying a New Testament? And so they're having this kind of imagined conversation as Margaret is trying to flee the authorities, and Agnes has gotten away. So yeah, just kind of some historical imagination there. And I did that because we had two long treks of 4 hours on the bus. And I thought, okay, we got to have some entertainment value here. So anyway, that was fun. Yeah, I'm developing a few more of those. Yeah.
Right.
So yeah. How do you think, oh, and I just wanted to also note that with people who are Swiss background, there were several Swiss communities in Moravia. Not all the Swiss went up to Palatinate in Germany and then hopscotched over to
Mhm.
the United States, to Pennsylvania or, Ontario or other places. But quite a few of them actually went east first. And we are discovering more and more about these eastern migrations as we go along, as more historians are looking into these court records and things like that. Shirley, this is kind of a hefty question. I feel like you're having to do actually most of the heavy lifting here. I'm asking you all these big questions. How can the experience of Anabaptist women and peasants speak to us today? You had some really interesting insights on our tour.
Well,
So,
you can't go into these areas and into this history without thinking about the relationship of church and state. And as we're all very aware of in North America, the questioning of the separation of church and state has never in my lifetime, and probably beyond that, been as strong as it is today in the United States. And so looking for the what some historians believe is like the germ of the idea that it's good to separate these two from each other, coming from Anabaptism, is both inspirational and instructional, I think, because if we are to speak to our own time, we can do so with more nuance and authority if we understand our history better. And so I was struck today by reading this little description that nationalism does not simply pick up and adopt Christian themes and symbols and stories. It adopts Christians too, and thus changes the identity of the church. In other words, when the holy migrates from the church to the nation state, it brings a lot of church along with it. When nationalism becomes the new religion, the nation state becomes the new church. The Christian church does not simply surrender and dissolve itself, it persists, but as a transformed system of formation that prepares Christian for service to the real theopolitical body, the nation state, which alone has the power to require the blood sacrifice. That's a quote from William Cavanaugh. And I think we're in the process of seeing these kinds of transformations from a role for the nation and the role for the state to being a merger of the two. And we have historically understood how dangerous that is. And it's not just dangerous to the state, it's dangerous to the church as well. I think another learning for today is that we're in another time of tremendous economic imbalance. And that's what was going on in the background that created, you have the printing press, you have these taxes and tariffs putting tremendous burden on the majority of the population who would be called peasants. And that's the background for the 16th century Anabaptist movement. And today, we have some similar forces at work. And in both cases, I think we're called to be particularly open to the pleas of those people who are suffering the most, and called to take the gospel of Jesus to them, and to recognize the importance of justice in what we do. And then finally, this question of nonviolence. I think every story that I heard on the tour and beforehand, whenever it has dealt with the question of violence, it has been a challenge to think of what is the nonviolent response, both in our own time and what can we learn from the past. I think Munster is a real cautionary tale for the world, not just Mennonites. And some people use Munster as a way to discount all of Anabaptism. In fact, if you look at the history of how Anabaptism was taught, it was, if I understand it correctly, for many years it was the Munsterites, and that was the reason to, dismiss and not even recognize that the majority were nonviolent, and that Munster was not the typical Anabaptist community. And so for us to recognize our responsibility to create strong communities of nonviolence today, I think we can find some very good support in doing that by looking to the past.
Yeah. Yeah. Are we ready for questions from the chat?
Yes.
Thank
you
you.
so much, Shirley. That was wonderful. Learning from the past, something, that will stick with me. We'll go ahead and read them to you, and then if either of you want to answer, that'd be great. Doug says, first of all, thanks for the broad overview using specific personalities. I am curious why the phrase little people is used. Is this phrase common in academic work or something else? It strikes me as an unusual term to describe those not male or in dominant societal positions.
That's a good question. So I was in graduate school 40 years ago, and at that point, women's history was really coming into its own. This would have been in the mid 1980s. And it was a term that we used just to kind of a shorthand for not a great male history, but that these were common people. It's a term. I don't know that many people are using it anymore. It's a good question, and I'll have to think about that. But I just use it as a shorthand for folks who, weren't very high up on the socioeconomic ladder, although, there are always exceptions like Helena von Freyburg and Elizabeth von Wolkenstein, but, who were, the workers and the laborers and the commoners in society. So maybe that's a good question. I'll have to think that through. Yeah. But at the time, we just used it in graduate school as like, okay, it's not just, we're looking at the social history here. We're not looking at, I don't know, wars and presidents and that kind of thing. So I don't know if that answers
One of the
question.
things that we could see, we didn't mention the arts, but the tour was very strong in the arts. Of course, we went to various famous art museums, the Rijksmuseum especially, but also the Bruegel paintings. They became much more vibrant and helpful as like painting the whole background of the 16th century. I doubt that Bruegel thought of them as the little people, but they were very alive and lively
Mhm.
in those paintings.
Yeah, that
Thank-
was at the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna.
There's another question here. Shirley, you had mentioned we tend to send out really long reading lists for the tours. You called out Troy's book in particular. Can you just list the questions being asked? Can you list the books that you're referring to just one more time?
Sure. I have a stack of them here, and I have
Well,
a few that I actually picked up on the tour. This one, if you go to the Anabaptist Museum in Austria, I would recommend that you get this book while you're there, because that's where I learned more about the woman in chains from the house. You saw the picture of the chain. I wrote a blog post about it. I couldn't have written the blog post without this book, so I will recommend this book.
can you list the title there, Shirley?
It's Anabaptist Hutterites and Hobbins in Austria, and it's by Reinhold Eichinger and Joseph Enzenberger, but I think it's only available at the museum itself.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think you can get it over Amazon, for example. I
Yeah.
think you have to go to the museum. Yeah.
And here is the profiles of Anabaptist women. This is C. Arnold Snyder and Linda Huebert Hecht, the editors of the book. Women in early Austrian Anabaptism. Again, Linda Huebert Hecht. We owe a lot to her, I believe.
Mhm.
And this one, I think I would just recommend this to any Mennonite, because whether you go on this tour or not, this is probably the best compilation
There you go, compilation. Yeah.
of the research that's been done, especially including the global history, which is really quite a challenging task.
Mary Sprunger is teaching that book now, and it just came out recently. I think that's a 2024 imprint. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Judy asks a question that I think I'll leave between Kim and Richard to answer. Can you compare the tours Shirley is talking about to the tours that will happen next year?
Kim, why
Yeah,
don't
I
you
mean,
go ahead? Yeah.
okay. So the tour that Shirley is talking about was kind of a big, 500th anniversary tour. Mary Sprunger and I will be leading that again in 2027. It starts in Vienna, goes into the Czech Republic. We'll visit Nikolsburg there. So there's some other things that are, the Falkenstein Castle is there. Niedersulz, the Women in Chains, the Anabaptist house is up between Vienna and the Czech Republic. And then we headed west through Austria into Switzerland, and then up the Rhine toward Strasbourg, and then into the Netherlands. Mary is a 17th century scholar. She's done a lot of primary research on Dutch Anabaptists in the Golden Age, and that's a 17-day tour. That's a longer tour. The one that we're talking about there are two that we're talking about for 2026, one in May and one in September. This would be a shorter tour that would start in Vienna, like the other tour, but it's shorter, and we would not go into Switzerland. We would dip down then into northern Italy, the Dolomite region there, and we would end in Venice. So that would be Vienna, Czech Republic, swinging around, then going west through Austria again, stopping at various points along the way, including Helena von Freyburg's castle, going to Innsbruck, and then heading south through the Brenner Pass, going from North Tyrol into South Tyrol, and then into this area, this beautiful Puster Valley, the Dolomite region of South Tyrol, and then ending in Venice, where there's some new, I'm developing a walking tour. of Venice. Hopefully won't get us completely lost there, Richard. I'm going to be counting on you. Venice is very confusing. Didn't we just cross the canal? So anyway,
Oh,
no,
Kim,
so
the whole idea is to get lost in Venice. That's part of the adventure.
let's go
That
get lost.
Let's
Let's
go
go
that's
get
what
get
I
lost.
thought someone said. You can't really get lost because you can't
You're
get
on
off
an
the
island.
island.
You can't get lost. You're not really lost, but you are.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean the difference was like the big tour that just happened and the one that'll happen in 2027 is like kind of the grandiose, like massive, like trying to get to us all these places, and then really focusing on Mary's expertise as a Dutch scholar, and then the 2026 tour is much more focused on Austria, North Tyrol, Sud Tyrol, Venice, and Czech Republic. We won't go into Switzerland. I hope that answers that question. So brush up on your Italian. Una cappuccino, per favore. That's all you need to know. No, I'm kidding.
Exactly. Well, I have a question. Kim, you talk of all of these women, they're all courageous and heroes in their own right. Who is your favorite of all of the people that you've learned and studied? Who is like just your girl?
Well, for the longest time, Helena von Freyburg was my girl. I mean, that castle is still extant. It's very compelling. It's a beautiful location. It's in northern Nord Tyrol. Kitzbühel is a gorgeous. I mean, it's just, and her story is so interesting about how she outwitted the authorities and just out debated them. But Agnes Link is starting to rise to the top of the chart of the Anabaptist billboard for me. She's just so just doesn't care about what the authorities think, and she is smart, and she talked her way out of being executed twice, and she disappears from the historical record. So she was never again apprehended. I don't know where she died or anything like that, but she was a fascinating person because she really did she spoke so fast, and she was so critical of the magistrate that it said that the scribe, basically, who was taking her testimony or taking her like record during her testifying in court, couldn't keep up with her. Like he finally just said, you know what, I can't deal with this anymore. So she was really awesome. And I think about how we've been taught to be the quiet in the land, and these women were anything but. I mean, they really, as Linda Huebert Hecht said, they spoke up, they took risks, and they were incredibly courageous. And I think that their stories are inspiring.
Kim, some of the questions we get asked about the tour that you're talking of for 2026 is the emphasis being the untold stories of women and peasants. What about are men welcome along on the tour?
Yes, and we do talk about men too.
Okay.
Conrad Grebel had his university days in Vienna. So we'll run into Conrad Grebel, we'll run into Hans Hut and Balthasar Hubmeier, Pilgrim Marpeck is right there along the Inn River. There are a number of men as well. And we had great participation from men on our tour. We definitely want men to come along. After all these hundreds of years of women learning about male history, it's fine for them to spend 13
Fair enough.
days.
Amen.
And it's women and peasants. So, it's also, and when you think about like, Jacob Hutter hanging out in Michael von Tutenhofen's Neuhaus Castle. I mean, that's, there's a story where men are central. So Sue Groff, how many days is the May tour? It's 14 days, 14 days, right? Do I have that right?
I think so.
It's 14 days, 13 nights. One of the fun things about that tour was that we got to stay at some really nice places as a way to check out, like where we want to have you for overnight. And I think Richard and Diane are doing a really great job of making sure that these places that we're staying are city center, so that we're not on the outskirts of Innsbruck, for example, so that people can get up early, or if they want to stroll around, the Altstadt, the old town in the evening. It's very, it's just a lovely, lovely area. All of these places are beautiful. And Brixen, didn't mention in my talk that we'll be staying in Brixen. That'll be our hub for our explorations of the Dolomite region and the Puster Valley. And Brixen doesn't even show up on most tour guides, and it is a lovely,
It's a
lovely
gem.
bill. It
Yeah.
is stunning.
Mhm.
Clausen, where Jörg Blaurock had his center of operations, we had a very interesting time in Clausen because according to the court records, the Hutters were apprehended in a sexton's house, that was right next to a Catholic church, which was right next to the footpath, the footbridge crossing the river there. And so we went to the TI and we said, okay, so how many churches are there here in Clausen? And she's like, 7. And I said, well, and the sexton, we found the sexton's house next to a Catholic church, next to a river. The sexton's house goes back to the 11th century. Now, I don't know for sure that that is where the Hutters were apprehended, and that sexton's house, but it seems likely. I don't, and we went and we asked, so this bridge, has that bridge, like, is that based on the historic, is that the point that people she's like, no, that there's always been a bridge there. It's been updated because we had to rebuild it. But if you go back in the records, you'll see that there's always a bridge next to the church, next to that sexton's house. And I'm like, I think that's got to be the place. But even if it isn't the place, it's a beautiful spot to tell the history of the Hutters there, and also Jörg Blaurock, and how he would come back to Clausen every after all of his wanderings around Sudan, North Tyrol, and baptizing people. He his rest for his R&R that he needed in between baptizing people and spreading Anabaptism. So also a beautiful little village that it isn't on the beaten path. Yeah.
It truly is amazing. Before we wrap up, Kim and Shirley, is there anything that you'd like to say, or are we good to carry on? We're good? Okay. There was 2 other comments in the notes, one asking about the slideshow, and we hope to share the webinar with everyone who's registered tomorrow. And also someone had asked about the book titles and authors, so we'll share that in an email as well to all of you so that you have that. Kim and Shirley, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kim.
My bibliography.
Pardon me?
Bibliography.
It's in the biography.
Exactly. We'll send you.
Mary and I came up with. I could send that out. Yeah,
Yeah.
I could find that.
You might get a five-page list, but that'll be good. It can be a goal to get to the rest of it.
Hopefully it's not that long. Yeah.
Kim and Shirley, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your time, and your heart with us tonight. At Tour Imagination, travel is much more than destinations. It's about connection and stories, and that's what we love. And so this evening has been a wonderful example of that.
If you'd like more information about the tours that Kim was referring to, the Vienna to Venice next year, the Untold Stories of Women, Peasants, and the Anabaptist Witness, please reach out to our office@tourimagination.com, or please feel free to check out our website, www.tourimagination.com. Thanks for joining us this evening, and we wish you all a great night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.